it says that, you don't see that, it says I only have 29 minutes, which is not true. But remember that in case you want to go for lunch, intermittent fasting has been shown to be excellent for your health. So just hold on to it. Okay, so today, as Luis has mentioned, I'm one of the person working on, with an empirical approach to understanding what are the effects of reading. Obviously, reading can be many things, and I do not study reading in general. I study a particular kind of reading, which is typically referred to as narrative fiction. For short, in my work, I just call it fiction. Of course, there can be narratives that are not fictional. Of course, narrative simply suggests a certain structure of typically a short story or a novel. But the vast majority of a narrative tends to be fiction. So for short, I use this term. And mostly what I'm referring to every time here is basically novels or short stories. Although there are other cultural products that I've studied, such as films, that have a very similar effect. We have investigated. I'm probably not going to talk about today because of time. So let me start from, so the idea is, I'm a cognitive scientist by training, and that's why I started investigating this, not because I was interested in the text specifically, but why, because I was interested in what are the factors that can change the way we think about the world. And by thinking about the world in cognitive science, we call it this social cognition, right? Cognition about social events. Social can be anything that has to do, an interpersonal relation, our relation with the institutions, our political life, economic life, and so on and so forth. As human beings, we're basically, as it has been repeatedly said, we are, of course, social animals, and most recently we have also been called the storytelling animal, right? As one of the an excellent book that I will quote today. So that's hence the title on the effects of fiction on social cognition processes, and I'm going to go through a variety of findings, some from human experimentation. It sounds ominous when you say it. It simply means we collect data with people. We don't do any weird stuff. But also, most recently, I've started using other tools, such as basically natural language processing or computational linguistics tools, and even the now infamous artificial intelligence tools that I'm beginning to use myself. Not to produce text, but as you will see, to understand what are possible characteristics, and particularly structural characteristics of the text that people read. Okay, so I tend to always start from the beginning. Usually I have more time, but so the beginning for us means, we used to be very furry and hanging out around the fire. We still do it from time to time. But why do I use these images? Because a year after I published the first paper of mine on this line of work, anthropology Polly Wisner published a wonderful article in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Science. Polly goes, she's a real anthropologist, old-fashioned anthropologist. She goes and lives with, in this case, tribes in Papua New Guinea to observe them for months, years at a time. And then she comes to report back. What do we learn from that? And these are some of their conclusions. She's mostly, and now you'll see why I started out with people camping around the fire. This is what she this is the laser? Yeah, okay, great. The night talks, by night talk she means simply when you're around the fire and you chat, you tell story and so on. What do people do? And she said, well, they do something very different, people, than what they do during the day. And she says, night talk plays an important role in a series of things, in evoking higher order of theory of mind via the imagination. Theory of mind is a central concept in my talk, so don't worry if you don't understand now what it is. It will be defined in a minute. More familiar, what this night talk does is convey attributes of people in broad networks that you call virtual communities and transmit the big picture of cultural institutions that help human social groups to generate regularity of behavior, cooperation, trust at the regional level. Now, obviously, some of these words seem to be, weird to be applied to very simple society, but they apply to everything, to all kind of society, all the way to the complex societies in which we live. And she's arguing that all of this happens because people at night hang out in Papua New Guinea telling stories. So she's putting the storytelling element as in the center of the human experience, basically, saying we have become what we are now for a variety of reasons, but over the few 100,000 years of our most recent evolution, because we have, as a consequence, as she mentions, of this discovery of fire, we found time, we hang out at night, and we told stories. So the importance of story cannot, I think, in the social science for now, cannot be really understated. Cannot be overstated. It is supposed to have played such a central role in a variety of ways. And the way we're going to look into more details today is the impact that reading, in this case, but also listening to stories impact the very way in which we think. So stories, until very recently, even in the Western world, but just to limit ourselves to what at least I know the best, stories were used for everything. We learn stuff through stories. The textbooks, as we know them now, it's a very recent invention, right? The idea that we extract some technical knowledge and then we teach it differently than not in a narrative format, is fairly recent. We used to teach now we tend to teach declarative knowledge, as Noemi mentioned this en passant earlier, in a different way. However, stories, as just mentioned, and as we know from basically our own history, even only the last 2,000 years of history in Western civilization, stories were used to teach us not only things, but also to teach us to think about things. In other words, stories indirectly, not in an explicit manner, shape the way we think. And that's really what at the core of my research project, and that's why I started looking at narratives to understand how social cognition processes are formed, changed, and can be, because they're malleable, can be changed, and perhaps from also a normative position can be improved. And then we improve we have to decide what it means to be improving something, but we will get there by the end of the talk. Now, the social cognition processes are, these cognitive processes are important for democracy. And that's why, one of the themes today is this. And I'm going to ask you to just hold that thought, and we will get back to why social cognition processes are important when we think about democratic life or life in a democratic society. But for now, I'm going to go back to a fairly brief review of the research that has been conducted over the last, not much, about 20 years, on the impact of reading fiction, narrative fiction, on social cognition. When I say it's only about 20 years, some people may be very surprised to hear that, because, of course, we have been writing about this for I'm sure Aristotle wrote something about it. In fact, all these plays and tragedies were about this, right? Teaching us how to live. What I mean that this has been investigated only recently in the last 20 years is, I mean from the perspective of experimental research, empirical research, in which we really try to separate what is causing what, and we measure as well, as precise as we can, the phenomena that we're interested in. So you see the difference between the two. This doesn't mean denying that this has not been thought before, of course, it has. But in terms of the empirical research on it, that is fairly recent. So virtually, up until very recently, virtually all research that has looked at the impact of reading fiction has looked at this concept that I just mentioned, theory of mind. That Luis introduced me, talk about empathy. For good reasons, it is often confused with empathy. It shares a lot with the concept of empathy, and maybe we will return to discuss the possible difference and similarities. But what theory of mind means is simply this is the simplest definition we can get, the capacity to represent other people's mental state. I understand an interaction, if you're watching a movie, listening to somebody talking, looking at two politicians discussing. I make inferences about, starting from what they say, of course, but of course you cannot always trust what people say. You decode their words, you decode their posture, you decode their nonverbal behavior, you decode the voice, and so on. And all of this we do spontaneously with the goal of understanding what people are thinking and feeling. Okay? That's, as you can imagine, perhaps the most important characteristics of human beings is this capacity. Life in a social world cannot be accomplished without this capacity. In fact, the population, one of the clinical population that we think has a deficit in this kind of processes, there is debate there, but mostly people think that it's that children with autism have a deficit on this capacity to understand what's in another person's mind. And in fact, it is difficult in social functioning. It immediately happens. What does it mean to study these things empirically? The first paper was published in almost 20 years ago, 2006, by some Canadian researchers that have looked at, they have measured fiction, and we're going to see, once you want to start empirical research, you've got to measure everything. That's the difficulty of it. And measure of theory of mind. And I'm going to show you how they did it. So to measure exposure to fiction, there are many ways of doing it, all pretty bad, in fact. But this is supposed to be, research shows, the best that we have. Presenting people with a long list of names is called the auto-recognition test. Long list of names. Some of these names are of published authors of fiction, and others are foil. They're name of people that, I don't know, maybe it's that person has published a little thing and some that is never really, nobody's aware of, but basically not known authors. Why do we do this? And sorry, the task to the participants is, well, circle all the names that you recognize as authors of fiction, okay? By doing this task, and by having some foils there, we can have a sense of the familiarity that a person has with the works of fiction. Of course, it's a proxy. There is no guarantee that if you circle Isabel Allende, you have read all her books, right? There is, obviously. But there is extensive work behind this tool that suggests that it's a pretty good proxy for the extent to which people read fiction. We correct for the foils that they choose, so we get some sort of a decent indication of how much they read fiction. Theory of mind, many different ways in which it can be measured. This has been, it was the predominant one when we start working on it. Now there are new tools, but this is a good example. Each participant sees one picture at a time, not two at a time, and your task is to guess which of these four mental states is the person experiencing. Okay? They're presented one at a time. As you can see, the words change every time. There is one correct answer out of four. And we could have a whole day debating as to whether it's possible to say that there is a correct answer. How do we know, right? But again, you got to trust me on this. The test has been developed by Simon Baron-Cohen in 2001, an expert on research on autism at the University of Cambridge, also cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen, that you may know, the actor. You have 36 of this trial, and so you get it's a performance test. It's not an opinion, and that's a very important difference. I'm not asking you how good you are at understanding people. Other scales do that. I find them slightly problematic, for a variety of reasons. So this is a performance test. There are others. And you get a score out of 36. There are 36 trials. What did they find, these authors, is that the more familiar you are with fiction, allegedly the more you read fiction, the better you perform at this task. And this was the original article by Raymond Marr and Keith Oatley and others that really opened up this field. And because they suggested fiction is a simulation, is a gym for social cognition. Fiction is a simulation of social life. And of course, how could we not to agree with this, right? When you read a book, also watch a movie, as it has been, or listen to a story. But when you read the book, you're immersed into this fictional world. It doesn't matter that it's fictional. Your mind treats it as real. And that's the beauty of it, right? Sometimes we get so immersed in it that we realize that, we don't realize anything is happening around us. An interesting finding, and but not much of an explanation of why this is the case, apart from what we just say. It's fiction, it's about social life, you read about it, you get better. It's an okay explanation, but not entirely satisfying, and this was our starting point. Mostly, I started this work with my former graduate student, David Kidd, and then I've continued with others. And these are the kind of questions that we started out with back in 2012, 2013. Now, so the question are this: is all fiction the same? Does it matter what you read? The answer is no. Well, I'll try to convince you that that's the case. Is it exclusive to written fiction? No. Films work too. Is it only about mentalizing? No. Reading fiction does not have, I mean, I don't have to convince you. You're here, you probably believe fiction, reading in general, and probably narrative fiction in particular, has a host of very positive consequences, I'm pretty sure. But what I'm saying here, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is not, from an empirical standpoint, not only we know that it does have an effect on theory of mind, but also on other processes. And this is what Luis was referring to when he said that I was now working on things that are closer to the idea of democratic life. And we're going to get that towards the end of the talk. And then also, I try to also describe to you how does this happen. How does reading fiction, actually different kinds of fiction, has all these effects on us. Okay, that's the map of the talk. Who knows? Because actually, we know something. We'll get there. So not all fiction is born equal. I'll ask you to. I put the Spanish translation on the right, but the English one. And I'm not sure how I did this with DeepL. I'm not sure how good it is. But I just simply ask you to read this. So take 30 seconds to just go through the list. Okay, so all these are titles of novels, of published novels. Some of you may have recognized some of these titles. I don't know whether in Spanish they've been translated like this, but these are the original. The originals are right. They're the correct one. Now, if I ask you, and I usually ask people to do this exercise, but I don't think I have enough time to do it today, so I'll do it for you, and I trust that you would have answered the same way. If I ask you to categorize this, how many are? 8 titles into 2 categories, it's very likely that you end up with something like this. The first 4, Blessing in Disguise, One Day at a Time, Until the End of Time, and Safe Harbor, are books published by Danielle Steele. You may know her. She has sold 600 million books, so you probably have heard of her. You also probably have heard of Jonathan Franzen, because this is highly educated, intellectual crowd. Jonathan Franzen is also famous for very different reasons. And these are the title of 4 of Jonathan Franzen's book. Now, what are the differences between these 2? If somebody has the answer quickly, I'll take it, otherwise I will tell you. I don't know how it translates, but the difference here is that these are basically cliché. I don't know how they were translated in Spanish for you, but all these are things that, your grandmother would tell you if something bad happened to you. Oh, that's a blessing in disguise. Or, take it one day at a time. You see, they're cliché that we use in daily life. Jonathan Franzen doesn't use cliché in his title, okay? Now, this is not really strong empirical evidence. I use this as an example to begin showing you the difference between what we call popular fiction and literary fiction. A highly contested category, one that got me into a lot of trouble over the last 10 years, and we will go through and see whether you agree with me. So, from an operational standpoint, what we did was we needed to identify novels and short stories that we could somewhat confidently classify as popular fiction, and also, the other way around, novels and short stories that we could confidently classify as literary fiction. We took the simplest, laziest, probably, way to do this. We looked at, at the time I was in New York doing research, we looked at the winners of the National Book Awards, NBA winners, and we looked at Amazon bestsellers. And we made sure that sometimes there is an overlap, right? A book can be a National Book Award winner and also top seller on Amazon. Doesn't happen often, but so we made sure that we had no overlap. And that was our first starting point to distinguish the 2 books. But here are more building on literary theory, of which I am no expert. I wasn't then, I still am not. But literary theorists with whom I've been collaborating says since agreed to identify some of the features of what makes a novel, a popular fiction novel, or a literary fiction novel. Apart from winning or not an award, these things seem to come up all the time. The focus of popular fiction is on the plot. They use stock characters. And readers can easily apply, this is very important, pre-existing schemas to understand, and their stereotypical knowledge to understand what's going on in the book. Okay? Popular fiction, literary fiction has a host of different characteristics. Of course, these are caricatures. I'm exaggerating. It doesn't mean that every single literary novel has this and doesn't have the first one, and vice versa. But these are the features that tend to distinguish them. They focus on the inner story of the character more than on the plot. Use what Susan Keene described as category-resistant, complex, and unpredictable characters. A category-resistant character would be somebody who does not behave according to the schema that you have, meaning according to the stereotype that you have. If I'm Italian, I'm also American, but I'm mostly Italian. If I invite you for dinner tonight, and you come over and I cook you an awful dinner, that would be a category-resistant behavior. It would not fit your stereotype of Italians, okay? That's the simplest example. The idea is that literary fiction is more likely to be populated by characters that do not fit our expectation. As a consequence of this, readers, us, cannot really apply easily the pre-existing stereotypes and schemas, but we have, in order to understand and to follow, when you read the book, it's imperative that you understand what's going on. And to understand what's going on in a literary fiction book is more important that you dive into the mind of the characters, trying to guess what is that they want, what they're feeling, what they're going to do next. Is more likely than in a book of popular fiction that is, you can anticipate it more. It's clearer because these people correspond to types. Is this clear so far? Okay. So here are a few slides, but I'm supporting my rationale, but I'm going to skip them simply, and I apologize. I don't like to skip things, but in the interest of time, I think I really do. Here, just to make sure, as I mentioned, I'm not arguing that these are two different worlds, okay? There is a large overlap between books that can be considered popular literary fiction, but there's also some difference that we think exists, and at the very end of the talk, I'll show you some structural, let's call them objective difference between these two classes of narratives. So what we did, you remember, we started out with this finding that reading fiction makes you allegedly better at understanding another person's mind, right? Performance, the more fiction you've read, the better you are in this task that measure your capacity to understand others. We read, and this is the article that, can I go back? Yeah. Luis was referring to in 2013, we started out with this article where we published not correlational data. No, correlation is where you measure two things and you see whether they go together or not. And they're excellent source of information, but you don't know what is causing what, right? That's what we call it correlational. To really know that reading X causes A and reading Y causes B, you really need to randomly assign you this. Actually, I couldn't even use this because you set according to your preference. I would have to mix you up and then randomly assign you to read one book or another. That's what we did 5 times in 5 different experiments with many books. And people read either a short story or about 20-25 pages, the first, of different novels that we previously categorized as literary or popular fiction. And we'll have some examples. This is the scheme of the study. I'll go to this in detail. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but 5 experiments, the first 5 that we ran, that we published. And then we measured, of course, we were interested in saying, if I make you read, even only for 20 minutes, a narrative that I think has the characteristics of literary fiction, unpredictable characters, obscure situation, focus not on the character but on the plot, and so on and so forth, or the other, immediately after, will I see a different performance? Your performance is going to be affected by depending on whether you've read one type of book or the other. Okay? So many books, hundreds, thousands of participants. The bottom line of these 5 experiments, and then we measure, right? How do we measure theory of mind? I show you already the one with the eyes is called the RMAT, which means reading the mind in the eyes test. Not a very original title, it's pretty literal, right? That's what it is. There are other tests of theory of mind. We find the same effects on all of them, so I'm not going to go into the details now. They've been published for many years now. I'll show you one graph that I think is kind of the picture that I want you to take, like the take-home message. So they did this test, and this is what happened. These are cumulative findings of a lot of experiments. On average, people in the control condition that they either read nothing or they read nonfiction, or they read the story of the potato or something like this, okay? They perform, on average, they get 25 correct out of 36 on the test, which is the average that is usually found. Those who read popular fiction do the same. It looks lower, but it's not really statistically different. They're pretty much the same. Those who have read literary fiction perform significantly better. Now, it's not a huge effect. It's like 1 point, right, on the scale. So statistically speaking, it's not, but it's a very significant effect that we have replicated again and again and again. Other peoples have not replicated. There has been a debate over the years. The cumulative knowledge is that this replicates pretty well. So what we learn from this is, it seems that reading literary fiction, perhaps for the reason that I listed before, makes you better at understanding another person's mind. Now, is this empathy? Does it make us more empathic? That is how it has been interpreted by the public, in the press, and so on. I'm a little bit skeptical about it, and we'll maybe return in the question sessions about this. All the data shows is that you become better in guessing what the person is thinking. How you then react to it is a slightly separate question, right? But we'll continue. So these are the replication, and so on and so forth. I will go quickly on this. What we did was the same study as they had done before. So no longer an experiment. We did a correlational study here. Again, we used the same instrument that they used before to measure how much people recognize authors of fiction. But instead of putting them all together, the authors, through statistical technique and then bottom-up and interviews, we ended up with two factors. It turns out that the name of the authors that are included in the author recognition test, they're not the same. There are some authors, you can probably recognize it. To the left is, these are what we tend to call literary fiction authors, okay? Those are mostly, glancing as, people authors that we would consider popular fiction writers. Now, I didn't do this, by myself, like decided, okay? Although it has face validity. I'm sure most of you can see it and say, oh yeah, it makes sense. This came out from the data, which is an interesting factor, right? So instead of having one score to say, let's see whether the more people read fiction, the better they are at your mind, suddenly we could do two things. Let's see if the more they read literary fiction, or the more they read popular fiction, how does this correlate to the performance of your mind? And this is what we found. The more you read literary fiction, the better you are at performing on this task. The more you read popular fiction, 0. There is no relation between the two. Now, I simplify some of the statistical empirical aspects here. Please, before publishing this on Facebook, ask me, check with me. This is all true and published, but I want to be sure that if you represent it, it's going to be represented well. But this result, we replicated again and again. It seems like, yeah, it's true, reading fiction helps, but maybe only certain kind of fiction. Now, the other question that we had was, is it exclusive to written fiction? Right? I mentioned before. 1 second. I mean, here we're all about reading, so I'm not going to, undermine the core message here. But films work too, it turns out. I'm not going to present the data, but when we show people art films or Hollywood films, we find the same effect. After watching art films, people perform better. After watching Hollywood film, flat line. Okay? Now, the other question I want to focus on, two others, are, it is not only about theory of mind. Because as I mentioned before, most of the research up on early 2000, but still now, has focused on how reading fiction improves our capacity to read other people's mind. It's good, it's important. However, that's not the whole story. We looked at other factors. We published a few articles in the recent years, as you can see. Recently, Nick Buttrick replicated our findings just last year. We looked at a variety of variables. What are these variables? These are what I, at the beginning of the talk, called social cognition processes, okay? That can be, mostly we call them thinking dispositions, or, do we have another slide here? Yes, social attitudes and belief. So what does this mean? As you can see, sorry, we'll go back, here. These are still on the cognitive style idea. In other words, how do you tend to perceive people in situations? And I'll give you an example of this too, don't worry about it. These are things that you're more familiar with. Attitudes towards immigration, believe in just world. We're getting closer to the life in a democratic society, right? We're no longer about, can I recognize what another person's emotion is? You know, what is my attitude about immigration, same-sex marriage, and, a variety of solidarity, economic solidarity, and so on and so forth. I'll focus on two things here. I don't have the time to go through everything, but I'll focus on attributional complexity and psychological essentialism. Noemi finished her talk earlier this morning talking about cognitive, not sophistication, but something along the line of cognitive complexity, cognitive skills. Critical thinking, very close to this concept. The next one. Let's start with psychological essentialism. Psychological essentialism is the belief that people and things have natural and essential common characteristics which are inherent, innate, and unchanging. Mostly here we're interested in people. If I believe that, men and women are like this because there's something about them, the Spanish and Italians are like this, then the certain people have a certain personality trait, and that's never going to change. They're always going to behave the same thing. This is what psychological essentialism is. Now, why social psychologists, that's really what I am or I used to be, are interested in this? Because it relates to a bunch of political attitudes. The more, in terms of psychological essentialism, you think, the more you think that this is the case, the more, let's say, the more conservative you are, for short, okay? And the less you think, the more liberal, progressive you are. It is measured by a scale, through a scale that is something like this. People answer this item. Generally speaking, once you know someone in one or two contexts, it's possible to predict how they will be behaving in most contexts. There is something simplistic about here too, right? But the simplistic aspect, we'll get to it in a moment with a different measure. So what do we find? Well, the more you read literary fiction, oops, this is the opposite slide. So this is actually the, no, was I correct? One second. See, yes, I apologize. The labels here are actually the other way around, meaning there is no, the more literary fiction you consume, the least likely you are to think in essentialistic terms. The more popular fiction you read, there is no much relationship with that. So there is no positive relationship. I apologize really for the slides here, but because it's the opposite, you have to flip it. But mostly, we do find the effect of reading literary fiction on essentialism. Now, the second one, perhaps the most interesting one, is attributional complexity. We're talking about critical thinking, which Naomi defined it today briefly for us. It's really about the idea of, I really consider things. I understand that there are multiple factors that explain an event and so on and so forth, right? And this is captured by a scale that is called, in social psychology, attributional complexity scale. And actually, I'm quoting here Monk, who wrote about the undemocratic dilemma. He says, facile solutions stand at the very heart of the populist appeal. Voters do not like to think that the world is complicated. They certainly do not like to be told that there is no immediate answer to their problems. Faced with politicians who seem to be less and less able to govern an increasingly complex world, many are increasingly willing to vote for anybody who promises a simple solution. That's not what I measure, but it's a great quote of somebody defining basically the lack of attributional complexity, right? And so you can see how important it is, in opposition, right, to be able to think in a complex manner, particularly about social events, for democratic life. So we measured these things, and the graph is correct. So the more you read literary fiction, the higher your score on the attributional complexity. Here, we do find the other way around for popular fiction. The more you read popular fiction, the less you are willing and able to think in a complex manner. Okay, so this is these are the two variables that I chose to kind of begin to tackle the question of, is reading important for democratic life? What kind of reading is important? And also, we could also ask what kind of democratic life, but it's too much for us. Well, to answer all of this. This is the first findings that I'm aware of that start to unpack how reading certain kinds of fiction or consuming other cultural products, as we've seen in movies, for instance, impact the social cognition processes that underpin our political and social attitudes. Okay, so this is where we are at now. I have one more. Do I have 5 more minutes? Okay, I'll get to that. So how does it happen? Right? It's. I'm sure you have ideas. Well, if in case you agree or you understood and you agree what I'm talking about, you may already have ideas. Maybe you had well before coming today about why reading, and particularly why reading certain authors may cause the kind of effects that we've seen here, right? But I'm paid to do empirical work, so I need to convince more than just saying this is what I think. So what is about these novels that makes a difference? We looked at a variety of things. Well, I started looking at this because just as Naomi was mentioning, every time I present these findings from Japan to South America, but particularly in France for some reason, you may have the answer to that. I am accused of being an elitist because I say, well, literary fiction has these positive consequences. And this is very far, and you will see from my last slide that that's not at all what I'm saying. But this prompted me to investigate. So the second part of that sentence was, you're an elitist. There is no difference between literary and popular fiction. It's just in the mind of the journalists, of the members of the juries, the elite, is the left-wing elite, typically. Curiously enough, the person who's saying these things are exactly the left cultural elite. But I took that critique, and I said, okay, let me see whether there are actual differences between the books that I use in my study, what people consider literary and popular fiction. If you're right, then there's no difference. Now, when you look at difference, what does it mean? If you have a text in front of you, you have to look at the words that they use, the sentence, the grammar, the syntax, the structure of the book. And that's what we did. We started out, first of all, you get a corpus, right? You need a lot of books. Not to read. I don't read that much. We have them in English first, and then we're working for other languages as well, that are published within the same 40 years and that have same characteristics, balanced by the gender of the author. So it's not enough to go out and start analyzing books. You have to have a real good corpus on which you do the analysis. So we started by doing that. This has been published, so you can check it out, with 50% literary, more or less, and 50% popular novels. So the first thing we did is to look at, there are millions of words, right? Sentences and paragraphs. We look at lexical and syntax complexity. And I'm going to go fast here, but it's not very difficult. As you can imagine, the more a book is as lexical complexity, the more likely it is that it is a literary fiction book as opposed to a popular fiction book. So the one here is definitely literary. The one here is definitely popular. And so we predict that, right? Same for syntax. Syntax is particularly important, and I'm not going to go into details, because there is a wonderful article by other people 10 years ago showing that the better you are in understanding complex syntax, the better you are at your mind task, right, of understanding other people's mind. So, and I'll skip that because I don't have enough time to go through it. This is the result. Then we looked at how explicit or implicit the language of these books is. And obviously you have to define about, explicit, implicit about what. We looked at the emotions so far. And here it is. Through basically computational linguistic tools, we have an indicator for every book of the amount of explicit emotions that are referred to, or the implicit emotionality that is conveyed in words that are not emotional words, but through the style of writing. What do we find is that the more a book contains explicit emotions, the least likely it is to be a literary fiction book. The more implicit emotionality it has, the more likely it is that the book is of literary. Why is this important? Because it really begins to tell us, the message here is, when we read the literary novels, there is much more implicit. And why is that important? Because if it is implicit, the reader has to make the inferential steps. Okay? Lisa Sunshine, wonderful cognitive literary scholars, have written about this quite a bit. I'll skip this, and I'm going to go through what I think are the least and the most interesting findings that are impressed now. We looked at, and this the statistics and the index are too complex to explain, but it's going to be very easy for you to relate to it. The idea is that, you remember from Aristotle to others, the idea of the narrative arc, right? We begin here, there's a problem, there's something that adds up, the tension of the novel, right? That's why we keep reading, and then we get to the middle of the book, and then it has to be resolved. That's what we call a narrative arc, okay? Now, that's a typical structure. A paper published in 2020 shows that these structures on this measure that is called cognitive tension is measured by looking at words. That part I'm not going to go into details. They've demonstrated, looking at millions of text in the Western world, that's a typical structure of a story. If we are right that the literary fiction is different, we would expect, yes, the same trend, but less so. In other words, popular books, which are in red here, start with the cognitive tension, increases, and then it is resolved, okay? Literary text follow the very same trend, but it doesn't get resolved to the same extent. Now, these are complicated, indices. The statistics are, not that complicated, but what this tells us is that they're not the same. The narrative structure of popular versus literary fiction is not the same. The next one, you're going to like it even more. What about emotions? These are positive emotions overall in the book. Popular text, they start out well, family is happy, crisis, things are really bad, crying, suffering, but then the happy ending of classic of Hollywood movies and of novels, okay? And this is a bit depressing. Literary novels, it's pretty, grim from the beginning to the end. There is a slightly linear trend here, but not much. So you see, the one on top is sometimes referred to as the Cinderella story, right? Things go well, crisis, okay, the prince finds me again. Literary fiction, this is not one book, right? These are hundreds of books, and this is the average shape of hundreds of books. I find these results particularly interesting, and really fitting also some of the stereotypes that we have about these books. Last thing, and I'm finished, and this is about to link it to artificial intelligence. One of the claims, let me go back because I don't want to spoil myself. One of the things we say at the beginning is that because of all the characteristics that we mentioned, literary fiction are less schematic. They don't evolve. People don't behave. The characters don't behave in the way we expect them. There is uncertainty there. Okay, that's the bottom line. If that's the case, we needed to find ways to measure how predictable a literary novel is compared to a popular novel. Obviously, we ask people, and we find some results converge, consistent with this. But then we turn to artificial intelligence. When you type on your phone, and your phone is guessing the word that you're typing, right? That's predictability, right? Does it on your phone. ChatGPT and other large language models do it in a more sophisticated way. That's what we did. We fed this text to BERT. And we asked them to guess the next word, the next sentence, and so on and so forth. And then we compare the capacity of predicting, the accuracy in predicting, right? And this is what we found. These are literary texts, and these are popular text. And it's not a great graph, but I put the red line to highlight it, is a very strong effect. Even the famous hyper-intelligent AI, yes, does a pretty good job, but there is a difference. Is less likely to anticipate, to predict what's going to happen next in a literary fiction novel. Now, obviously, to some extent, it's obvious. Large language model it's us. So, that's what it is. But it's a very efficient way to demonstrate that even on the predictability, this happens. And last slide, Why does this matter for democracy? Well, some hints I think I already gave you. Some of these variables, direct psychological essentialism, attributional complexity, the idea of accepting uncertainty, are all characteristics we associate with more or less with progressive ideas in a democratic society. And that's what is represented here. However, and this is the surprise, because, and that's why I am particularly upset when I get accused of being, hyper-progressive elitist who thinks that we should all read, I don't know what, Franzen or somebody else. I don't believe that, because I think that, in fact, for a society to function properly, we need both. That's why, why do we have popular fiction is, in the beginning, it was popular fiction, right? I mean, literary fiction is a very recent phenomenon, really recent invention. Our ancestor didn't read sophisticated characters, stories with people whose emotions could not be understood. They really straightforward, simple, schematic, right? Those stories are excellent to build a sense of community. And that's why Polly Wisner describes them. These people in Papua New Guinea tell this story. Oftentimes they're a myth about the society, right? There cannot be ambivalence there. There cannot be like, who knows? No, this is who we are. This is where we're going. Think about the Bible, right? All basically well-organized and clear. It has a function. It holds a society together. It has negative consequences, as we know, as well. But it's not all bad. And that's what I call the centripetal forces. But on the other hand, if you only have that, you ended up with some sort of ossified society where nothing changed, highly, let's call them nationalistic and so on and so forth, because it's all our way of being. This is who we are. There is no space for uncertainty, change, development. And that's, I think, why cultural products of literary fiction is one of them. There are probably others, many others, have a different role to play in our society. They kind of question the schemas, without destroying them, a question enough that allow for some sort of, stepping back and rethinking that's the only way to do things. Or we can adapt the schema, change it, substitute it, and so on and so forth. That's really probably what Martha Nussbaum talks about in her Cultivating Humanity book, to some extent, with different words, but I see some similarity. So that's why I think the two are important. That's why I'm not saying don't read popular fiction. I read plenty of popular fiction myself. I enjoy it. I love it. And it has that kind of satisfying, feeling to it. Things are as they should be. It's something we like. We can admit it. I am admitting it here. You can come out and admit it yourself. Now, last sentence is this, for me, and that's what I think. I hope to work with Luis and others next, maybe tomorrow, as implication for the market. Because the products, popular fiction, Hollywood movies, market is fine. Produce them, they sell them, people buy. There's no need to support this. But if we want to have also centrifugal forces, we do need to support literary fiction production, theater, independent movies, and so on, because they are different. People do not buy them just as candy as they buy the popular products. And I think that's the tension, and that's probably, I think implicitly the models that we have in Europe, to some extent also the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States, at least until last week, had the mission of promoting this. Maybe not, thinking through all these steps, but that's why I think this is important. That's why I think accumulating the evidence of the kind that we and others accumulate has some meaning and purpose. Thank you.